Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue covering the Scotch defense with the Steinitz Variation, which is a strange sideline which almost nobody plays, but still I think you have to be prepared for the move because it can be tricky to face. And as you can notice, I'm not home or in the office. I actually came for a holiday with my work colleagues this weekend, so we are in the beautiful island of Brač. And you can see some of my friends here lighting a fire and walking around. And yeah, I actually want to show you what it looks like here. I'm on a beautiful terrace here overlooking the sea, and down here they're starting the barbecue and stuff. So yeah, I chose the Steinitz Variation because it's simpler than the others, and I want to have a simple video to make while on holiday over the weekend. Then I'm preparing for the Croatian Cup finals, which are starting on Tuesday. So I'm going to have hard games next week. I'll probably be playing 4 games. I'm the substitution in our team. We have Leon Levi, Chai Young, International Master on board 1, almost 2500. Matej, my coach, is board 2, 2370. And we have 1 International Master and 1 FIDE Master playing boards 3 and 4. And I'm going to be the substitution playing on board 4. In some of the games last year, I scored 75%. I had 3 out of 4, which was good. You can actually find the videos in the Road to GM series. And this year, it's I think it's going to be a bit harder than last year because I'm probably going to be playing a bit higher rated opponents. But still, we took a break from work this weekend, came to Brač, and now I'm preparing for the tournament, and they're making barbecue. Okay, so the Steinitz Variation, let's get into it. As I said, it's a sideline after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, ed4, knight d4. We are now looking at the main move. So far, after e takes d4, we have been looking at the gambit lines with bishop to c4, the Scotch gambit, and c3, the Gehring gambit. And from now, we're going to be covering knight takes d4, which is the most sensible move and the best move for white in the Scotch, simply recapturing the pawn right away. And now we can see the main feature of the Scotch game. The fact that black no longer has the e5 pawn helps white control the center, of course. And now you can see that the e4 pawn is exerting pressure on f5 and on d5. And on the other hand, black doesn't have a pawn controlling the center, so it's going to be much harder to control central squares for black. What else happened after the Scotch game, the move d4 and e takes d4, is that we now have an almost semi-open center. Both files are semi-open, and you no longer have the tension in the center with the 2 central pawns, so it's much easier to develop the pieces. You don't have to maneuver around. White doesn't have to play the moves c3 and stuff like that. No side will really have an outpost on f5. And normal plans that you see in king pawn openings, such as the Italian or the Spanish, don't work. White isn't going to be remaneuvering his knight over to g3. Black isn't going to be playing e7 and then g6, bishop f8, bishop g7 and stuff like that. So there are no slow maneuvering plans. Both sides have diagonals to develop to. Both sides have chances for an attack, and the Scotch is a very open opening, and you have an open center with well, much quicker games, I would say, than in the Italian or in the Spanish. And we are going to look at the normal moves from this position. We are going to look at bishop c5, bishop f6, and bishop to b4 check, which are the 3 most common moves. And in this video, we are going to focus on the Steinitz Variation, which is a sideline, but it can be deadly. And that's the move queen to h4. Queen to h4 is a simple-looking move you would expect from a beginner player, perhaps, because it sort of doesn't go along with the classical chess principles. It develops the queen too early with a very simple threat of capturing the e4 pawn. And once you think about it, the e4 pawn is really not so easy to defend. The options that you have now on move 5 for white, which shouldn't really be played, well, basically the only option is the move queen to d3, which defends both the knight and the pawn. You cannot move the f pawn because it's pinned, you cannot move the bishop because you lose the knight, and it's really hard to defend the pawn. So the move queen h4, if you face it on the board and you don't know it, might be tricky, and you might blunder away. here. In the live book, there is one most common move, that's knight to c3. I'm going to explain that move in detail. The second most common move is knight to b5, simply threatening the c7 pawn. And the move queen to d3 has been played 7 times, and after queen to d3, black basically wins all the games. Black wins 75% of the time with knight to f6 and 100% of the time with bishop c5 and a6. So it's really tricky to defend this after queen to d3. If I turn on the engine, it's going to say that with knight to f6 black is equal or slightly better, and white has basically justified the move queen to h4, and it's much easier to play for black. So we are going to be focusing on knight to c3 and bishop on knight to c3 and knight to b5. By the way, sorry about the noise. It seems that some of the neighbors are drilling something or doing construction. I'm not sure. This is a small village on the island of Brač, and the noises are not as in my office or in my home. So okay, let's continue. So queen to h4, let's look at knight to b5 first, because that's a sideline. Queen to h4, knight to b5. Knight to b5 is a counter threat. If black takes, which he's going to do in almost every variation, then white will play simply bishop to e2, accept being a pawn down, and try to go on from there. Black doesn't have time to do much more because of the c7 threat. So after bishop to b5, there are 2 most common moves. Now knight to b5, I'm sorry. There is bishop b4 check and bishop c5. Bishop b4 check puts white in check, so white doesn't have time to take on c7. White defends with bishop to d2, and now the e4 pawn is ampri, of course, so queen takes e4. After queen takes e4, white continues his development, and black now has to react to the threat. He has to play king to d8. If black takes here, after queen takes g2, white actually wins most of the games because of the move bishop to f3, and now you cannot defend both the threats. The queen cannot defend the c7 pawn, so now you basically lose the rook. So after bishop to e2, this is a trick you cannot take on g5. You can try and play queen to g5, queen to e5, but I think f4 would chase the queen further away, and you are in trouble once again. So after bishop to e2, queen to d8 is a forced move, and white simply castles. And now if you look at the material situation, white has given up a pawn, and it is the central pawn. Black has an extra d pawn. But white has a lead in development, and he has castled, while on the other hand the black king is on d8. Once again, I'm sorry about this. I'm not sure what they are doing. I think they might be cutting the grass or something. Yeah, I hope the sound is okay. I actually have no room inside to record, so I have to be outside. Okay. After the move castles, black should exchange the bishops. Bishop takes d2 and knight takes d2. And in this line, I would really prefer to have white. The engines actually like white as well. As I said, up in development, better pieces, the misplaced queen on e4, which has to move already, and the king is in a tricky position on d8. I think especially because it's lined up with the queen on the d file. And the fact that the bishop can go to g4 can lead to trouble for black. So that would be after knight to b5, the move bishop to b4 check, which I wouldn't recommend. I think that bishop to c5 is a better move. Bishop c5 is the main move. And now white can continue with the move queen to e2, seemingly defending everything. Now you are threatened with checkmate, so you don't really have to have time to do much more. If you take on c7, king to d8 is going to win the knight. So now white can play either queen to e2 or queen to f3. Queen to e2 is a better move. Knight to f6, reinforcing the threat on the e4 pawn. Bishop to e3, trying to exchange of the bishops. Bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, and now the threat of c7 is once again strong, but now black plays his own counter threat, knight to b4. And now if c2 is taken, then the queen is dropping, so white doesn't have time to take on c7 once again because black wins the knight. So bishop d3 and knight to a6, defending the threat. And in this line, white didn't even give up the pawn. White still has 7 pawns, and I still prefer white. So the Steinitz variation, even though it's tricky, if white knows what he's doing, I would prefer to have white in almost every variation. Let's look at that once more. So now we are looking at, after knight takes d4, queen to h4, we are looking at the move knight to b5. I think that if you know what to do against the Steinitz Scotch, then, and if you are aware that you can give up the e4 pawn, then you are going to be better or fine or at least equal. If you try to defend the pawn, then you can be in trouble. So, bishop c5 is the best option. I would say queen to e2 should be your response. Knight to f6, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, knight to b4 attacking c2, and now bishop d3 defending, knight a6 defending. And if this is the start variation, you could argue that this knight is misplaced now that c7 is defended, but I would argue that the a6 knight is much worse, and that the bishop on c8 is much worse than the bishop on d3. So I would prefer to have white. Now let's look at the main move. Knight to b5 has a similar idea to knight to c3, which is the main move against the Steinitz Scotch. But knight to c3 is sort of an in-between move trying to defend d4. The problem is that after knight to c3, black simply plays bishop to b4, pinning the knight. And now you have the same problem once again. If you play queen to d3, then knight to f6 is coming, and you don't really have time to do much more. So now you play the move bishop to e2, or knight to b5 with the same ideas. If you play knight to b5, the difference is that black now has bishop a5 defending c7, so he sort of parried your threat. If after knight to b5 queen takes c4 is played, then you transpose with bishop e2, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and you are still threatening the c7 pawn. So this isn't really the way to play. The way to play for black is after knight to b5, bishop a5, defend your threat, and then continue by taking this pawn if white isn't careful. And white can't really do much. Bishop to d3 is considered a bad move. Bishop e2 is much better trying to castle. If you play bishop to d3, let's just see what the best move is. Yeah, a6 just chasing the knight away, and then I guess b5 trying to embarrass the knights. And you could be in trouble. So a6 is the response. So bishop to e2, after knight to b5, bishop a5, bishop to e2 should be played, and now a6, knight to d4. Still, what's the difference? I wonder. Okay, let's see once again. Bishop a5, bishop to d3. Play a6 now. Yeah, the difference is that you cannot play knight to d4 here because he takes, so you have to go here and then b5. I'm sorry. So knight to b5, bishop a5, bishop e2, and now a6, knight to d4 is a possible move. And now, of course, the pawn is hanging, black is going to take, and then your knight is going to be hanging as well, so you are going to have to recapture on c6. So knight to b5 as the first move could be slightly inferior to bishop to e2. So let's go back. After knight takes d4, queen h4, knight c3, bishop b4 is going to be played every game. I would recommend the move bishop to e2 first. After bishop to e2, black can simply take, and then you are saving your threat of knight to b5 for later. Queen takes c4, knight to b5. Now the main move for black is to take the knight simply, because if white castles, then there are going to be two threats, and this is with check, so white doesn't have time to take on c7. So bishop takes c3, b takes c3, king to d8 once again. Okay, and now after white castles, this is basically the starting position. I'm sorry if you can now hear my friends, there's a lot of them downstairs lighting a fire and making barbecue, but those are the conditions I have to record, I'm sorry. Okay, so after castles, the starting position in which white has given up a pawn and he has doubled pawns along the c-file. On the other hand, he is going to have a tempo on the queen either with bishop f3 or bishop d3, and the black pieces don't really have a way to develop normally. If the black bishop tries to develop with d6 and then trying to go out on that diagonal, then everything is weakened. Let's say d6 here, then I think white is simply winning after this. I'm not sure that black can defend this. Let's say he parries like this. Perhaps just this simple move. Let's say queen takes, trying to be greedy, and I think that white is winning. So black has to be extra careful after castles. And your king might seem safe behind the pawns, but it actually isn't. And all the positions I've looked at are fairly tricky for black to play. In the live book, white wins 56% of the games, and black with his best moves wins 30% of the games. After the move a6, white actually wins all the games. There are only draws for black. So it's a tricky position. So you should remember that after a6, knight to d4, white is much better. Knight takes d4, and after c takes d4, you have straightened out the pawns, and white is now a pawn down, while black has the king in the center, so that's not a good move. After castles, you should simply develop with knight to f6. Just leave the knight there while the king is defending. Bishop g5 is the main move, pinning the knight. Rook to e8, trying to develop another piece and of course putting pressure on the e2 bishop. Bishop to d3, gaining a tempo on the queen, and after queen to d5, now we get to the point of the initiative for white. Everything is defended. You have three minor pieces dangerously placed around the board, and now you get to play queen to h5 because the knight is pinned. So now you are not only threatening the h7 pawn, but in many variations, of course here now we are threatening bishop f6, winning the queen. So there are a lot of tactical possibilities for white here, and black. The fact that he's a pawn up is completely irrelevant because he is currently 2 pieces down. So I would say that playing 2 pieces down against white with so many developed pieces is a very dangerous thing to do. And perhaps the engine can defend. It doesn't say it's completely winning. It's more than +1, but not completely lost. But yeah, I would never have black here. The best move is rook to e7. Simply defending the queen because now bishop f6 is not check. Queen to h4, double pressure on f6. The queen was now attacked. d6, trying to develop the bishop, and now simply bishop takes f6, g takes f6, queen takes h7, winning back the pawn. And I think that this is a very comfortable position which you should be able to win against almost anybody. This is really tricky to play for black. Firstly, where do you develop the bishop? Secondly, if you develop the bishop, how do you move the king and develop the rook? It's really scary. So let's go back to the starting position. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e d4, knight d4. If you see queen h4 on the board, the only thing you have to know basically is that you can give up the e4 pawn and that you don't develop your bishop to d3 because your knight is hanging. You develop it to e2, where black can never take on g2 because of bishop f3. So bishop e2 is a fine move in conjunction with losing the e4 pawn. And your plan is knight c3 and knight d to b5, putting pressure on c7, forcing the king to d8. There are no other moves for black. If he plays rook to b8, you are going to take and check the king. So king to d8 is the best move. So the Steinitz variation is, I would say, a bad move, but it's hard to punish. If I saw it over the board and if I didn't know that it's fine to give up the pawn and develop my bishop to e2, I think I would either spend a long time or try to defend my pawn with queen to d3, because it's really hard to see the consequences. After queen h4, queen d3, knight f6, how is this so much worse? I really don't see why this would be equal or better for black, and the engine seems to like black and thinks that this move is now justified. And black does have a strong initiative now. I mean, now black is the one developing all the pieces, and you are pinned, and you are 2 moves away from castling. Black is going to castle now, and I really like black's position, in fact. So it's really hard to see this over the board, and not many people would give up the pawn with check, but remember that you have to do that. So either knight c3 or knight b5. Knight c3 I think is a better move. Knight c3, bishop b4, remember bishop to e2, queen g2 is not possible because of bishop f3. Force the king to d8 and then just develop normally and try to create an attack. So if black tries to be aggressive with the Steinitz variation in the Scotch, he's actually the one getting crushed if white knows what he's doing. Okay. I hope you like the variation. Sorry once again about the conditions. As I said, we took a vacation for the weekend, and I really don't have a room in which I can record quietly. I'm going to record one more video from here tomorrow, and it's going to be a slightly more serious variation. Yeah, let me know what you think. Thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.